Don Isidro Cienfuegos set the last fence post of the morning into the dry Durango earth and stood back to look at the line stretching toward the ridge. He was 63 and still dug his own posts, not because he lacked men for it, but because the land was one of the things a man needed to stay close to. He leaned on the post driver and thought, as he often did at this hour, that the ranch was very quiet for a place where a woman had once lived. If you believe that a door closed against a woman who gave everything is not the last word, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo now and ring the bell, because this story is for you. Her name was Esperanza Rivas, and she had spent the last 9 years being someone else's necessity. Her sister Dolores had married into the Bracamontes family of San Juan del Rio, a name that carried weight in the valley, the kind of weight that presses down on those beneath it. Dolores had 2 boys in quick succession, and then her health began to fail. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the way rivers in Durango run full in June and dry in August. Esperanza had come to help with the boys when the older one was 3. She had planned to stay for a season. She stayed for 9 years. The Bracamontes family had tolerated her presence the way they tolerated most inconveniences, silently and with a precise accounting of what they were owed. When Dolores died in the 5th year, Esperanza did not leave because the boys, Rodrigo and Mateo, were 8 and 6, and nobody else was going to put them to bed or teach the younger one to read or convince the older one that grief was not the same as anger. She stayed. She cooked. She mended. She stretched the household money when the Bracamontes patriarch, Don Ezequiel, mismanaged the cattle sales 2 years running. She asked for nothing. She received nothing. In the ledger sense, no wage, no title, no formal recognition of what she had become to that house. Then Don Ezequiel's eldest son, Gerardo, came home from the city with a wife and plans. The wife was from a good family in Torrin and found the arrangement. A woman of no blood relation living in the house and managing the kitchen. Peculiar. Gerardo explained it to Esperanza the way his father had once explained it to Rodrigo's teacher why the boy was missing school, briefly, without apology, with the implicit understanding that the decision had already been made before the conversation started. "We appreciate what you've done, Esperanza. The boys are old enough now. My wife will manage the house." He paused. "We'll need your room by the end of the week." Esperanza looked at him. Then she looked past him at the kitchen doorway where Mateo, now 14, was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, staring at his uncle with an expression that was trying very hard to be something other than what it was. She looked at the boy a long moment. He was taller than she remembered from even 6 months ago, and she thought of how she had found him, at 6 years old, sitting in the corner of this same kitchen with his mother's rebozo in his lap, pressing his face into the cloth. She had sat beside him on the floor without saying a word. They had stayed there until the light changed. "Tell Mateo goodbye for me," she said to Gerardo. "He won't want to do it himself." She was right. Mateo did not come out of his room. But as Esperanza walked through the main gate of the Bracamontes property with her bag over one shoulder, she heard the scrape of his window opening above her. She did not look up. She kept walking, her shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders against the morning cold. The photograph of Dolores and the boys tucked against her chest inside the shawl. She had taken nothing else that was not hers. What none of the Bracamontes family had thought to ask, in their haste to reclaim their house, was where Esperanza intended to go. She was 41 years old, without savings, without a husband, without a reference anyone in the valley would accept from the Bracamontes name after what they had just done. She had the clothes on her back, the shawl, the photograph, and the name of a ranch an hour north of San Juan del Rio. a working property called La Ciénaga, owned by a widower named Isidro Cienfuegos, who she had heard, at the market once, was looking for someone to manage his household and take care of a small herd of dairy goats. She had heard this the way you hear things you store away without knowing you'll need them. She had needed them now. The road to La Ciénaga was unpaved and ran along the base of a dry sierra that softened as it climbed toward pine. The land was the color of ash and copper at this hour, and the air had the particular edge of Durango mornings, which are cold even in summer and give no apology for it. Esperanza walked the first hour. A woman from the village of Salcedo was driving a burro cart loaded with corn and offered her the empty board beside her. They did not talk much. The woman dropped her at the fork in the road where a painted sign read La Ciénaga, Propiedad Privada, and Esperanza walked the last 20 minutes alone down the track between Mesquite and Huizaque. She heard the goats before she saw the house. A sound like an argument that everyone involved has already given up trying to win. Then, the house appeared past the curve of the track, long and low, stone and timber, with a wide corridor facing south and a garden along the east wall that had once been well kept, and was now in the process of forgetting what well kept felt like. There was a pale brown goat standing in the middle of the corridor, eating something off the bench. Don Isidro was coming out of the barn when he saw Esperanza coming up the track. He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the bag. He looked at the goat on the corridor bench, as if measuring whether this situation required his immediate attention or could wait. "Is that goat yours?" asked Esperanza. "That's Canela," said Don Isidro. "She gets out. She's eating your bench." "I know." He looked at Esperanza with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned that the first thing you notice about a person is rarely the most important. "Who are you?" "Esperanza Rivas. I heard you needed someone for the goats and the house." She looked at Canela, who had stopped eating the bench and was now looking at Esperanza with the solemn expression goats deploy when they are evaluating something. "I know goats. I know households. And I'm available right now." Don Isidro studied her for a moment. He was a large man, unhurried in the way of men who have spent decades learning that urgency usually makes things worse. His wife, Esperanza would learn later, had died 6 years ago. He had 2 daughters in the city who called when they remembered, which was not as often as he pretended not to notice. "There's a room off the east corridor," he said. "The garden is a disaster. The goats need milking at 5 in the morning and again at 5 in the evening, which nobody here has been doing consistently. There are 7 of them. Canela is the worst." He paused. "I pay a fair wage. I won't pretend it's more than it is." Esperanza set her bag down on the stone step. "When do I start?" He looked at her again, that full, measuring look. "You just did," he said, and went back into the barn. Canela followed Esperanza to the east corridor room and stood outside the door while she unpacked her bag. She placed the photograph of Dolores and the boys on the small ledge above the window, where the morning light would reach it. She folded the shawl on the chair beside the bed. These were the things she owned. She had fit her life into a bag, and her life was still intact. The first morning, she was at the goat enclosure before 5. Don Isidro was already there, sitting on the stone wall with a clay mug of coffee, watching her in the early dark the way he watched the Sierra, without expectation, just to see what would happen. Canela let herself be milked without protest, which the other goat handlers, she later learned, had found impossible. Esperanza did not use force. She used patience and a low, even voice, and her hands on the animal's flank until Canela understood that this was someone who knew what she was doing. "The others respect her," said Don Isidro from the wall. "Animals always know," said Esperanza, not looking up. The days that followed had the quality of something building slowly, the way the Durango Sierra builds, layer by layer, without announcing what it is becoming. Esperanza returned the goat enclosure to order, established the twice-daily milking routine, and within the first week had the 7 goats producing consistently enough that Don Isidro's field hand, a wiry man named Victorino, stopped shaking his head every time he passed the pen. She attacked the garden next, the east wall strip that had been left to go to seed, with the methodical energy of someone who has learned that visible order is the fastest way to earn quiet trust. She planted what she found in the old seed tins in the storeroom: marigolds, squash, a row of chiles, 2 tomato starts. Canela stayed close to Esperanza wherever she went, which the other goats appeared to accept as a reasonable arrangement. Don Isidro watched all of this without comment. But he began appearing in the kitchen doorway in the mornings while the coffee boiled. Not because the coffee needed supervision, but in the way people station themselves near something they find themselves needing, without quite yet being able to say so. She learned that the 7 goats each had a personality as distinct as a household's members. There was Paloma, who gave the most milk, but was suspicious of anyone who approached without speaking first. There was the old one they called Vieja, who gave almost nothing but whom no one seemed willing to retire because she had been there since before Don Isidro's wife died, and that gave her a certain standing no one could articulate but everyone respected. There was a pair of young ones the field hands called Los Gemelos, because they were inseparable and aggressively curious and had once gotten into the storeroom and eaten half a sack of dried corn. And there was Canela, who continued to position herself as Esperanza's shadow and personal evaluator. Esperanza began making fresh cheese from the morning milk, a soft white cheese she had learned from an aunt, pressing it in a cloth and hanging it to drain in the cool of the storeroom. The first batch she set out at the midday meal without comment. Victorino ate a piece and said nothing, which she understood to mean he approved. Don Isidro ate 2 pieces and looked out at the Sierra, which she understood to mean the same thing. The second batch she sold 3 wheels of to a woman from the neighboring ranch who came by on a Thursday, and she put the money in the kitchen drawer without mentioning it to anyone. When Don Isidro discovered it at the end of the week, the money in the drawer and the account of 3 wheels sold. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment with a particular expression Esperanza was beginning to recognize. It was the expression of a man who is being surprised in a direction he had not expected and is quietly deciding what to do with that. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. The milk was surplus. It made more sense to sell it than to let it go. He looked at the drawer. "That money is yours." "Half of it," she said. "The other half should go back into feed." He looked at her a long moment. Canela from the doorway observed this exchange with her standard expression of composed authority. Don Isidro picked up his coffee, went to the corridor, and sat in his chair, and Esperanza heard him say something to Victorino outside that she did not catch. And then she heard Victorino laugh, a surprised sound, as if he had not expected to, which was the best kind. One evening, after the goats were settled and dinner was cleared, Don Isidro asked Esperanza where she had come from. She told him. Briefly and without ornament, the Bracamontes family, 9 years, the boys, the room at the end of the week. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a while. Then, the Bracamontes family. Yes, I know Ezequiel Bracamontes. He sold me a mule 10 years ago that went lame in a month. He paused. I was not surprised by what you just told me. Esperanza almost smiled. She looked at Canela, who was standing just outside the kitchen doorway, eavesdropping with the focused attention of an animal who understands more than she lets on. It was the first time anyone had said, in so many words, that what had happened to her was not surprising. It was a small thing. But small things, when you have been told implicitly for years that your situation was your own fault for being necessary, have a weight entirely out of proportion to their size. She did not say this to Don Isidro. She looked at the grain of the kitchen table and thought about Mateo at 14, stiff and formal at his uncle's side, pretending not to care about anything, and she hoped the boy would find someone who would not require him to pretend. She hoped he would remember that she had sat beside him on the floor when he was 6 years old and his mother had just died, and that she had not told him it would be all right, because she did not know that it would be, and that he had pressed his face against his mother's shawl and cried, and she had stayed there until he was done. You cannot be replaced by someone's wife from Torin, she thought. Not the sitting on the floor part, not the 4 in the morning fever part. Those parts are yours. She looked up and found Don Isidro watching her. He had the expression of a man who does not read minds but has spent enough years reading the Sierra to know when the weather inside a person is different from the weather they are showing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because he had asked honestly, not entirely, but close, he nodded. That was all. He refilled his coffee, and they sat in the kitchen until the dark outside was complete and the tecolotes in the mesquite started up. And neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything it did not need. 6 weeks after Esperanza arrived at La Ciénaga, a man came to the ranch on behalf of the Bracamontes family. He was a lawyer from Torin, thin and deliberate, with a leather case under his arm, and the manner of someone who has been told to solve a problem without being told to be kind about it. He said he represented the estate of Dolores Bracamontes, Norivas, deceased, Esperanza's sister. He said the estate had recently conducted an inventory of the Bracamontes properties in connection with the transfer of the household to Gerardo's management. During that inventory, he said, certain items had been discovered in the walls of the old kitchen, items that had been hidden, evidently, by Esperanza's sister before her death. Silver coins. Old ones. 43 of them, which the family had initially believed to be part of the general estate. A notary, however, had since examined Dolores's personal papers and found a handwritten document, witnessed by the parish priest of San Juan del Ro, stating that the silver was Dolores's personal inheritance from their mother, kept separate from the Bracamontes estate, and intended for her sister Esperanza in the event of her death. Inside the old clay jar where the coins had been found, there was a folded paper that was about to change everything. The paper was a letter, written in Dolores's hand in the last months before she died, when she still had the strength to write clearly. The lawyer opened the letter and read the relevant portion aloud. Dolores had written, "I know you will stay after I am gone, because that is who you are, Esperanza. And I know that those people will use that part of you and not thank it. Take the silver when they tell you to leave. It belongs to you. It always belonged to you. You gave 9 years of your life to my children, and that is not something anyone can ever repay. But I want to try." The lawyer placed the letter and the inventory document on Don Isidro's corridor table, beside Esperanza's clay coffee mug. Esperanza did not speak for a moment. She was looking at the photograph in her pocket. She had taken it out without realizing it. Dolores at the boy's birthday, laughing, her hand on Rodrigo's shoulder, Mateo squinting into the sun. Don Isidro sat across the table. He had stayed when the lawyer arrived, without being asked, in the quiet, weight-bearing way of a man who understands that some moments require a witness. "What does the family say?" asked Don Isidro. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The family disputes the validity of the document. They intend to contest." "On what grounds?" They claimed the silver was found on their property and therefore belongs to the estate. Don Isidro looked at the notarized letter on the table. He looked at Esperanza. "And what does the notary say?" The lawyer almost smiled. The small, tight smile of a man whose job it is to deliver documents and not opinions, but who has opinions nonetheless. The notary says the document is valid. The witness, the parish priest, is still living and has confirmed his signature. 3 weeks later, after a notary from Durango City had reviewed the documents and confirmed their standing, a second letter arrived at La Ciénaga addressed to Esperanza. It was from Gerardo Bracamontes. It did not mention the silver. It said only that Mateo had been asking about her, and that if she wished to write to the boy she was welcome to do so, because evidently there was nothing more to be said on the matter of the estate. Esperanza read the letter once. Then she put it in the same drawer as the photograph and closed the drawer. When the Bracamontes family's lawyer made a final visit to La Ciénaga, this time with a settlement offer, which amounted to keeping the silver and paying Esperanza a fraction of its assessed value in exchange for signing away any further claims, Don Isidro received him at the corridor. He listened to the offer. He looked at his own boots for a moment. "She's not available for this conversation," he said. The lawyer looked toward the kitchen door, from which the smell of fresh bread and something with chiles was making the whole corridor smell like a home. "Perhaps she could be. She's working," said Don Isidro. "And she's not interested in fractions of what's hers." The lawyer left. Victorino, who had been pretending to mend a fence post within earshot, allowed himself a small nod and went back to his work. That evening, Esperanza found Don Isidro at the paddock fence, the same fence where she had first seen him the morning she arrived, talking to a horse he kept in the pasture beyond. He was doing the thing he did, speaking in a low voice to the animal, not expecting a response, just putting words somewhere outside himself where they could breathe. She did not interrupt. She stood at the corner of the fence and looked at the Sierra going dark above the mesquite, and after a while he stopped talking to the horse, and they stood there in the evening silence. The kind that asks nothing of you, except to stay in it. "The coins are yours," he said finally. "I know. What will you do with them?" Esperanza looked at the garden she had been building along the east wall. It was not finished yet. It would not be finished for a while. "Plant things," she said. "Keep working." She looked at Canella, who had appeared at the paddock gate with the alert expression of a goat who believes she is about to be relevant and get a better latch on that gate. Don Isidro made a sound that might have been a laugh. Canella pushed her head through the lowest rail and looked at them both with satisfaction. Months later, when the east garden came fully into bloom, the marigolds and the chiles and the squash, and a row of Zinnias Esperanza had added in April from seeds a neighbor had given her. People who came to La Ciénaga for the first time noticed the garden before they noticed anything else. They noticed that the goats were fat and orderly, and that the corridor bench was no longer being eaten. They noticed that Don Isidro, who had been known in the valley for years as a man who kept mostly to himself since his wife died, laughed more than he used to, and said things at the market with a directness that suggested he had recently been reminded of something he'd forgotten. Esperanza was usually in the kitchen or the garden when people arrived. She came out unhurried, with her shawl over her shoulders and flour on her hands, and she received whoever came with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who no longer has anything to prove to anyone. The photograph of Dolores and the boys was on the ledge above the kitchen window now, where the light reached it all morning. She had written to Mateo. He had written back. 3 lines, careful and formal, the way 14-year-olds write when they want to say more than they know how. She kept his letter in the same drawer. Sometimes life pushes us out the hardest doors so that we can arrive at the ones that were always waiting to be opened from the inside. Esperanza Rivas did not leave the Bracamontes household looking for silver or a garden or a widower who talked to horses in the evenings. She left because she was told to leave, and she left with her dignity folded inside her shawl, where no one could reach it. And she found, as people sometimes do, when they have given enough of themselves to know their own worth, that the world has a way of returning what is owed. Did you ever have someone believe in you at the exact moment you were starting to doubt your own worth? If this story reached something in your heart, leave your comment below. Tell us from where in Mexico or from wherever in the world you are watching tonight. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear that being shown the door is not the same as losing your way. Until the next story, a warm embrace, heart to heart. And remember, never underestimate the woman who stayed quiet, worked without thanks, and still knew every morning exactly who she was.